Today we're going to cover the 10 most important constitutional rights. In the United States, the Bill of Rights outlines several crucial constitutional rights that citizens should be aware of. Here are the top 10 rights protected by the U.S. Constitution. Number 1, freedom of speech. The First Amendment protects the right to freedom of speech. This allows individuals to express their opinions and ideas without government interference. Now, this right isn't absolute or limitless. For example, hate speech, yelling fire in a crowd, or inciting a riot are all forms of speech that can be limited, and you can be prosecuted for a crime if this form of speech causes or leads to harm happening to other people. For example, hate speech. If you're yelling verbiage at somebody that's either race-related, sex-related, or sexual orientation-related, that's considered hate speech, and you can be prosecuted for that. If you yell fire in a crowd of people and a stampede ensues and somebody gets seriously hurt or injured, you can be prosecuted for a crime. The third example I gave is inciting a riot. If there's a large crowd and you do or say things that cause a fight or provoke people in the crowd to begin fighting, you can be charged with inciting a riot. So yes, you have the right to freedom of speech. Please be aware that this right does have limitations, and you always need to respect others when exercising this right. Number 2 is freedom of religion. The First Amendment also guarantees the right to freedom of religion. This ensures that individuals can practice any religion they so choose, or no religion at all, or multiple religions. The government simply cannot limit what religion you choose to follow. Number 3, the right to bear arms. The Second Amendment protects the right of citizens to keep and bear arms, subject to certain regulations. Here are 8 regulations or situations that can limit your right to bear arms. Number 1, felony convictions. Individuals convicted of felonies may lose their right to possess firearms. The courts have ruled and held that it is a reasonable restriction to prevent convicted felons from accessing firearms. Number 2, mental health. There are laws on the books in most states that prevent individuals who have been adjudicated as mentally incompetent from possessing firearms. This is for obvious reasons. This simply reduces the risk of them harming themselves or harming others. Number 3, domestic violence. Now, this often comes up in my criminal defense cases, and it's the law in many jurisdictions. Individuals subject to restraining orders or convicted of domestic violence offenses may be prohibited from possessing firearms. One classic example is a situation where your significant other gets a restraining order against you. It can be your significant other or somebody you were previously in a relationship with. During the time that the restraining order is active and valid, you can't possess a firearm. You either have to relinquish it to a family member or friend who will hold it for you until the restraining order dissolves, or you have to turn it over to law enforcement and they will hold the firearm for you until the protective order is dissolved. Number 4, age restrictions. There are laws in place that restrict the possession of firearms based on age. For example, federal law prohibits individuals under the age of 21 from purchasing handguns from licensed dealers. Number 5, public safety concerns. The government routinely regulates the possession of certain types of firearms or ammunition that are deemed especially dangerous, such as fully automatic weapons or high-capacity magazines. Number 6, location restrictions. As I'm sure many of you have seen, schools, government buildings, public events, there are usually signs saying no firearms. There are laws in place that prohibit the possession of firearms at these certain locations. So if you have a firearm, even though you may legally possess it, be conscious of where you are, because you can't go to your child's school with a firearm. It's against the law, state and federal. Number 7 is registration and licensing requirements. Many jurisdictions require firearm owners to register their firearms and obtain licenses, which may involve background checks and other screening processes. This right to bear arms is not automatic. If you go to any reputable firearms store to purchase a firearm, they will do a background check. Number 8, is illegal activities. Now, this should be obvious, but if it's not, we're going to talk about it. The right to bear arms does not extend to the possession of firearms for illegal purposes, such as using them to commit a crime. It's also important to know that in many jurisdictions, and I know for sure here in Louisiana, if you possess a firearm, even though you may legally possess that firearm, if you're also in the possession of a controlled dangerous substance such as cocaine, heroin, marijuana that you don't have a prescription for, you are in violation of the law. That is a crime. Possession of a firearm in the presence of a CDS is a felony offense here in Louisiana, and I wouldn't be shocked if it's a crime in many other states. Now that we've covered 8 restrictions that can apply to your right to bear arms, let's move on to the 4th most important constitutional right, and that is protection from unreasonable searches and seizures. The 4th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution safeguards against unreasonable searches and seizures by law enforcement, and it requires warrants to be based on probable cause. So what does this mean in the real world? A classic example would be a situation where the police come to your house and they ask you, "Sir, do you mind if we come in and search for guns and drugs?" You have a right to say no, ask the officer or officers if they have a warrant. If they have a warrant, you have to submit to the search. If they do not have a warrant, you have a right to ask them to leave and return when they have a warrant. Now, obviously, there are real-world situations where the officer may put his hand in the door, put his foot in the door, claim he smells marijuana or some other drug, or even claim that he believed somebody inside was in danger, and simply forces their way in. If this happens, there's nothing you can do at the scene to stop it. Remind the officers that you don't agree to the search without a warrant, but please remain calm and stay out of their way. Hire a lawyer and let the lawyer deal with your constitutional rights being violated. Number 5, the right to due process. The 5th Amendment guarantees the right to due process of law. This protects individuals from arbitrary government actions. So what is due process? Due process is very simple. When you think about your due process rights, I want you to think about 2 things only. Notice. Put me on notice. I need to be put on notice that you believe I did something wrong, or you want to sue me, or you want to rule me in court. You have to give me notice. This usually happens by service by law enforcement. A police officer or a sheriff deputy will provide notice by serving you at your house or your job. The second step to your due process rights is an opportunity to be heard. This simply means if someone makes an allegation against you and it's criminal in nature, you have a right to be put on notice and you have a right to respond. Somebody sues you in a lawsuit, you have a right to be put on notice or served with the lawsuit, and you have a right to respond. If either one of those 2 steps are missed, your due process rights are violated and you can take legal action as a result of that. Number 6, the right against self-incrimination. Now, this is also found in the 5th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, and all it means is that individuals cannot be forced to testify against themselves in a criminal case. You have a right to remain silent. So if you're ever charged with a crime or the police want to talk to you, remember to invoke your 5th Amendment right to remain silent and ask for a lawyer. Number 7, the right to a fair and speedy trial. The 6th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution guarantees the right to a fair and speedy trial by an impartial jury of your peers. This right to a speedy trial can be limited based on a lot of factors. For example, COVID-19 significantly impaired the ability for anybody to get a speedy trial. For a large period of time, many of the courthouses were closed, car wrecks were still happening, crimes were still being committed, people were already in jail who had been sitting and waiting for several months or even years in some situations to get a trial. Even now, we're still dealing with the effects of COVID-19. So although you have a right to a speedy trial, chances are you will be waiting quite some time before your case goes to trial. The second reason is that there are other cases that happen before your case that may have a priority fixing. So as you can imagine, if there's a 3-year-old armed robbery case, it's going to proceed to trial before an armed robbery case that happened 3 months ago, typically. Now, there are situations where Your lawyer can file a speedy trial motion, and the prosecutor could move your case to number one and make you a priority, and your case could go to trial. The third way your right to a speedy trial can be delayed is if you're the defendant in a criminal case, your own actions. For example, if you don't show up to court for several weeks, months, or even years, and law enforcement is unable to track you down, well, if they catch you 10 years down the road, you don't get to say, I want my trial tomorrow, or why didn't y'all take me to trial 10 years ago? If you're the source of the delay, then you essentially waive this right to a speedy trial. Number 8, protection from cruel and unusual punishment. The 8th Amendment prohibits cruel and unusual punishment, ensuring that the punishment for crimes is not excessive. As many of you know, there are several states across this country that still have the death penalty statute on the books and are actively putting people to death. I'm not in favor of the death penalty, but I understand why families of victims may want the death penalty in their specific case. Is it cruel and unusual? I believe it is, but I don't get the final say. None of us do. It's those guys in D.C. at the Supreme Court, and as we sit here today, it's still on the books. It's still considered constitutional, so that's what we have to deal with. Number 9, the right to privacy. Now, although this isn't expressly mentioned in the Constitution, it's often inferred from the other constitutional amendments. Now, in the day and age we live in now, the right to privacy, obviously it includes the inside of your home, in your yard where there's a fence, a privacy fence, of course. However, if there's a situation where a helicopter flies over or a drone flies over and they see illegal activity on your property, there is no reasonable expectation of privacy for things that can easily be seen. So it's interesting, and it will be interesting to see how the litigation develops and how the law develops with respect to especially drones, because now drones are pretty common items that people own. I own a drone. Many of us just fly them recreationally. But I'd love to see what's going to happen when somebody's flying a drone with their kid and they catch somebody burying a body in their backyard or something. I'd imagine the court's going to say there was no reasonable expectation of privacy for an activity that could clearly be seen from overhead. Number 10, equal protection under the law. The 14th Amendment ensures equal protection under the law, prohibiting states from denying any persons within their jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. All this simply means is the law is supposed to apply the same to everyone. Man, woman, white, black, U.S. citizen, non-citizen, resident of the specific state, non-resident of the specific state. Now, in reality, we know that's not what happens in way too many cases. Race comes into play, national origin comes into play, sexual orientation comes into play, sexual identity comes into play. None of those things should matter under the law. And the 4th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution prohibits those things from factoring in to how the law is applied to individuals. However, we know that's not the case. And if you're able to somehow prove that you're not being given equal protection under the law, there's actionable relief you can seek in court. That covers the 10 most constitutional rights to be aware of. Now, obviously, this list isn't exhaustive of all your constitutional rights, and it's also important to note that the landscape is always changing. All of these rights are constantly in flux, where they're being expanded or restricted based on rulings by the various courts throughout this country. Stay aware, people, and protect yourself, protect your family, protect your rights.